Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us so far. And thank you, Amin and Dr. Holland, for fantastic presentation. My name is Hamid Tavakoli, uh, and I'm a landscape architect and researcher since 2016. In this section, I would like to go through the most transformative yet controversial part of the generating financial sustainability for cemeteries, going through 3 strategies for saving land and future cemeteries. I would talk about reuse, reallocation, and optimization, simply RRO of burial spaces. Now, first thing first, why RRO, reuse, reallocation, and optimization of burial spaces are necessary? Well, there is at least 6 reasons. First, urban areas are running out of suitable land, which is equal to us facing land scarcity. The other reason is that reusing maximizes limited land. Therefore, it is equal to social environmental sustainability, if you like. Another reason could be maintaining existing cemeteries is often cheaper than acquiring land. It is pretty obvious that it would be most cost efficient if you maintain the existing footprint of cemeteries rather than expanding our cemeteries outside the boundaries of our cities, specifically talking about the encroaching agricultural land nowadays, talking about Australia, let's say. Another good reason is that many cultures and faiths have traditions of temporary burials. So we can utilize such cultural adaptations. And I'll go through this one in further detail in next slides, specifically talking about the burial shortage of grave infrastructure in Sydney at the moment, and how companies like Metropolitan Memorial Parks and other cemetery trusts can utilize these RRO burial spaces to respond and address the current problems. Another good reason for using RRO burial spaces is obviously financial viability of that. And importantly, it just ensures future generations also have access to burial spaces. For example, if somebody dies, then for the next generation, there would be not enough space for them to be buried inside the existing cemetery. They possibly should be pushed away from the existing. This practice, RRO of burial spaces, could ensure equity of access for future generations. Now, before we dive deep into reuse and reallocation strategies, let's go and look at the real local case study done by GMCT in Altona Memorial Park in Melbourne. This is a fantastic example. Here, a smart design turned a traditional cemetery into an active, financially sustainable urban space by stacking and consolidating cremation positions, which is also a retaining wall. They increased capacity, generated new revenue, and made the site more vibrant and community focused. This is a great reminder that with the right planning, cemeteries can honor the past while funding their own future. Now, obviously, like everything else, there would be ethical, legal, and cultural opportunities and constraints for these RRO practices. I should say cons or constraints could be basically revolving around public resistance. People are not happy to have a cemetery in the backyard, or there are some ethical concerns within the ethnic communities or smaller communities. There are also some cultural norms basically suggesting you're not allowed to touch an existing grave. And clearly, there are many religious objections towards reuse or reallocation of existing graves. On the other hand, there are some other opportunities that we can utilize to implement such RRO practices. If we work with transparency and trust, we can make sure that people would be attracted to reuse and reallocate the existing infrastructure. Also, there are many cases that people are happy with reuse or reallocation. There is already existing grounds for cultural acceptance within our communities. So we can understand them first and utilize them once needed. The other thing is that if we implement respectful practices, for example, record keeping or other dialogues and community engagements, as Dr. Holden mentioned, could really help to facilitate such RRO practices. Again, these are pretty multi-layered and overlap with each other. The financial sustainability which we present today, the three aspects of that, RRO, multi-purpose spaces, and RRO of burial spaces, all overlap in many cases. Respectful practices, if we can implement respectful practices, we can anticipate we would have more people coming to us for reuse and reallocation. And finally, there are a huge amount of religious flexibility amongst different communities and ethnic communities, for example, in Muslim communities, for reuse and reallocation, which unfortunately hasn't been utilized yet in Australia, as far as I can see. Now, moving to the next phase, reuse, reallocation, and optimization practices must conform to at least 4 aspects. First of all, they need to complement the larger operational necessity of the cemetery. They shouldn't be a burden to existing cemetery, but rather they should complement, and grave reuse should be maintaining the overall cemetery operations. The second aspect that our practices must conform is land optimization. If you're doing something, but we are not saving some land or not optimizing land, probably something is wrong. So we have to make sure that this is relevant to NPV of the project, as well as generating some land, free land in our existing cemeteries. The third part must conform to cultural sensitivity of the larger environment. Again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. We need to tailor every single approach based on a specific community, the specific target community which we are working with. If you're working with Muslim community, if you're working with Christian communities, Lutheran communities, Jewish communities, we need to understand their cultural sensitivity and address such sensitivities. And finally, we need a new typology of governance. That's the very important thing. And in fact, if I'm going to redo this slide later on in the future, I might just put the governance safeguards on top rather than bottom. Because you see, this is a top-down process, is not a bottom-up process. We need first to generate those advanced governance tools and regulations to be able to utilize those 3 aspects. As far as I remember, the latest Burial and Cremation Act belongs to Australian Capital Territory in 2020. And in fact, that Cemeteries and Crematoria Act 2020 Act is addressing space renewal, RRO of great infrastructure. But again, there is a long way for us to go through. And I think if there is anybody from the government agencies in this meeting, I highly draw your attention to this aspect of governance safeguards and how we can enhance our existing law and regulation regarding death care and cemeteries. Now, across the world, cities are rethinking cemetery spaces, honoring heritage while maintaining land responsibly. Let me quickly walk through 8 proven models here. The first model is time-limited grave leases. In much of Europe, families purchase rights for 3 to 75 years. When the term ends, remains are respectfully moved to an ossuary or columbarium, and the plot can be reused. The second method is lift and deepen method, used in UK, in Adelaide quite recently, South Australia, and South Africa. There, remains are carefully lowered, specifically after a certain amount of time, the shaft deepened and the new burial is placed above. Basically, you squeeze, if you empty the below grounds and just squeeze down the existing compacted sort of burial sections, therefore, it just increased the vertical capacity without expanding boundaries. This is a very good technique. You see, at the moment, with the traditional method, we could have maximum 2 up to 3 interment per grave. But this method, you can go up as far as 5, 6, maybe 10 if you like, depending on your machinery and the technology you're using, could significantly change the game for us. The third method is continuous regulated reuse, specifically in the Scandinavian countries, combines high cremation rates with strong municipal oversight. Oslo and Copenhagen keep supply stable even in dense and urban contexts. As you know, these two cities are pretty dense, and this is pretty much overlap with the first item time-limited grave leases, but the regulation could change. The fourth method is reuse after 75 years. It is important because it is already implemented in England and Wales, and is moving towards formal legislations. This is something that I mentioned before. We need to provide more advanced legislations in order to support RRO of burial infrastructure. The fifth method is ossuaries, columbarium, and green cremation, pretty much the same as covering the first and second topic. The green cremation, like alkaline hydrolysis, these methods could reduce land use and environmental impact while respecting ritual needs. The sixth method is perpetual reuse in Islamic practices that provides culturally grounded sustainability through shared or sequential family graves once decomposition is complete. If somebody from Metropolitan Memorial Parks of Sydney is here, I think that the key to your current issue, the shortage of infrastructure in Sydney, could lay into this specific component. As you know, Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney already filled. There is a sort of controversial proposition to reuse the existing Carnarvon golf club to form a new cemetery for Islamic communities. And I think if you think through this again and you try to utilize these reuse and reallocation capabilities amongst Islamic communities, which are pretty growing in Australia, in Melbourne and Sydney and all around Australia, they could help us really well. The next method is infill burials. This is very simple. If you've got a cemetery in perpetuity or you've got an old cemetery, you can map out the existing empty spaces and you can reuse them depending on what you need here. And finally, vertical mausoleums. Vertical and high density mausoleums are common in Southern Europe, Latin America, and increasingly in Australia, and pairs memorial architecture with compact urban form. So these are the 8 global models. And again, these are not all one solution fit for all, but rather it depends on what is your cemetery conditions, what is your site condition, what is your ethnic communities that you're dealing with, or sort of communities that you're dealing with. And these are pretty tailor-made, must be tailor-made, directly responding to the communities rather than just a physical practice. Now, this is a takeaway from this part 3 of this presentation, a goodie from us. I just categorize these different methods as a part of my research, and now I think we can specify at least 3 thematic categorization of those methods, which was discussed in previous slide. You got 3 methods possible. Whether you want to replace or remove burial in short or long run, then you call it land renewal and reuse models, just like lift and deepen technique, which I've discussed before. The next method, the second method, is is thinking about having a permanent burial, but optimizing the space through increasing the density and other methods, for example, mausoleums, natural burials, and so on and so forth. And finally, rethinking the perception of burial, for example, using green cremation. So it would be pretty compact. It does not have a significant impact on land acquisition and land use. Therefore, cultural and environmental innovation can be considered as the third category of these thematic categorization. Again, these are really depending on your site condition and the communities. You may use 1, 2, or 3 of these methods at the same time, depending on what you need. But at the end of the day, we need to guarantee that they create financial relief for cemeteries, provide less environmental impact, and changing the traditional perception of burial amongst communities. Now, going through conclusion here, I would like to give you a roadmap how to create space renewal process in a cemetery. Probably you would have an urban cemetery which is facing spatial limits, and you wish to have a multifunctional, nice, sustainable cemetery. These are the steps to proceed through these methods. First of all, you need to understand your cemetery space limits. What are your limits? What is your requirements? What are the communities that you're dealing with? And this is the basics. It is equal to feasibility study that you need to understand the larger context of your site before deciding what to do, what is the next step. In order to do so, again, as we discussed before, we need to reframe our legal frameworks. We need to rethink our legal frameworks in order to ensure fairness and prevent mistrust amongst communities. To do so, we need to have comprehensive community engagements. This requires respectful dialogue and education within the community, and make sure they're happy, they're understanding that. And again, going back to the previous discussion, we need to find those religious flexibilities and utilize those flexibilities to make money out of these possibilities. And finally, it requires a clear record keeping. We need to implement immaculate record keeping due to the fact that we need to maintain the trust and safeguard the heritage. And I can assure you that this could end up to a sustainable cemetery space, which is multifunctional, as Dr. Holden covered, multifunctional green spaces created. Now, this brings us to the end of the discussion, part 3. But please don't forget to register for our future webinars. Topic 1, financial sustainability, already crossed over 3 topics. Topic 2 in February 2026 would focus on social sustainability, is basically thinking and talking about the mental health, grief, and how space users are interacting with cemeteries and what is the best practice of doing so. Topic 3 in April 2026, environmental sustainability. It looks like a green infrastructure handbook for cemeteries, if you like. And please don't forget to register for this one, because this is a really good one, focusing on green infrastructure and how to utilize planting and green infrastructure in different cemeteries, old and new. Topic 4, sustainable governance. And again, as I discussed before, sustainable governance sits on top of all these aspects, because the process through cemetery making and cemetery development is more of a top-down process where regulation would provide or facilitate space for these aspects, such as financial or social sustainability. And finally, topic 5, August 2026, hopefully, we will talk about cultural and ritual evolution, thinking ahead, thinking for 2050 and beyond, to understand what we need for our cemeteries to consider to be future ready.